And we have 5 people watching on YouTube. Yeah. Okay. So hello, everybody, and welcome to the new webinar series of 2021 of the IGCP 707 project. Today, we have the pleasure of having Dr. Blaine Mccleskey with us, presenting his research on the geochemistry of arsenic at Yellowstone. Before we start, I will introduce Blaine. He started his career with the USGS Geological Survey in 1997 as a chemist in the National Research Program. In 2010, he obtained a PhD from the University of Colorado, where he developed a method to calculate the electrical conductivity of natural waters from its chemical composition. He has published more than 70 papers and is involved in several research projects in Yellowstone National Park, a wildfire-affected watershed, and acid mine drainage sites. Blaine also runs and maintains the USGS Redox Chemistry Laboratory in Boulder, Colorado, where analytical methods for determining the redox distribution of iron, arsenic, chromium, and antimony have been developed. Blaine is a very enthusiastic scientist. He immediately accepted to give this talk, and we are super happy and grateful for that. So now it's time to enjoy and learn from his lecture.
Well, thank you, Jessica, for inviting me to present today. And this is, I think, really timely for us because we have a manuscript in preparation for this work, and I really look forward to any feedback or thoughts you all may have to help improve it. And at this time, I'd like to recognize my co-authors. So first, Kurt Nordstrom, who spoke in this series last fall. He's now an emeritus with the USGS, but he's really the long-term PI on this work in Yellowstone, and really initiated most of it, and is still really involved with it all. And he's been a really great mentor and friend to me. Shallow Hurwitz, who's an amazing geochemist, primarily working on volcanic and hydrothermal systems. And I've had the pleasure of working with him a lot over the last 5 years and exploring a lot of new places in Yellowstone. And then David Roth, who's a fantastic analytical chemist and a close colleague in Boulder. And he's also been involved in Yellowstone over the last 5 to 7 years. And then Madison Johnson, who's a master's student working with us now, and she prepared many of the GIS figures shown in this presentation. So while this presentation focuses on arsenic and thermal and river waters in Yellowstone, it's really a worldwide issue, as you all know. It's a geogenic contaminant in surface and groundwaters, and the World Health Organization recognizes it along with fluoride as the 2 geogenic contaminants of greatest concern. The US EPA set the standard for drinking water at 10 micrograms per liter. And thermal waters in volcanic areas around the world contain elevated arsenic concentrations. And these are often 3 to 4 orders of magnitude greater than the EPA drinking water standard. And these thermal waters are known to really impact downstream water resources. So here's just some examples of elevated arsenic and thermal waters at a few geothermal fields around the world. And most of these waters, as I just said, impact downstream water supplies. In Yellowstone, the highest that we've measured is 17 milligrams per liter in a thermal feature in Norris. Other hotspots include Lassen in California, Otatio, Kamchatka, and some thermal fields in New Zealand. And so a lot of what I talked today is probably applicable to other areas as well. So in this talk, I want to show the distribution of arsenic in Yellowstone thermal waters, the geochemical processes affecting the arsenic concentration, arsenic speciation and redox transformations, and then the riverine transport of arsenic. And so Yellowstone's been a really unique natural laboratory because there are over 10,000 thermal features there, including hot springs, pools, geysers, mud pots, and fumaroles. And these all have a wide range of chemistry. And most importantly, we have the chemical composition of these waters collected over many years. And we have more than 350 analysis from individual features. We have many more than that, but these are just from individual features at nearly every thermal area in Yellowstone. There's also been numerous scientific studies on the arsenic speciation and redox chemistry, and then also a lot of studies on the transformations of arsenic, most of which are biologically mediated, and I'll touch on that a little bit. And then Yellowstone is also unique in that there's a large network of stream gauges, and we've performed many synoptic sampling studies where we're able to determine the source fate of arsenic. And we're also able to get really accurate flux estimates of arsenic from the park. So just a little bit on the volcanic history of Yellowstone. So Yellowstone has had 3 major caldera forming volcanic eruptions over the last 2.1 million years, with the most recent occurring between 630 and 640,000 years ago. It's formed what's now called the Yellowstone Caldera, which is here in the dark purple, and here's the outline of Yellowstone and then Yellowstone Lake. So not surprising, as a result of all these eruptions, the geology in and around the Yellowstone Caldera includes large rhyolitic lava flows and tuffs, which are shown here in the red. And then the yellow are just the superficial deposits, including alluvium, glacial, and landslide deposits. And so currently there's a large reservoir of silicic magma beneath Yellowstone that fuels an extensive hydrothermal system. And most or many thermal waters emerge through these volcanic rocks within the caldera. And that goes through the water rock interactions is what really controls the surface chemistry. And so a couple notable exceptions are the thermal features at Mammoth Hot Springs on the north side up here, and then at the Snake River Hot Springs down at the south, which emerged through sedimentary material, including the Madison limestone. And so, as I just mentioned, most hydrothermal features emerge within the caldera or just outside the boundary. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So here's just a typical cartoon showing the generation of thermal waters in Yellowstone. So first, you have meteoric waters feeding either the hydrothermal reservoir or mixing with the ascending thermal fluids. And so the hydrothermal reservoir overlies the magma system and contains about 350 milligrams per liter chloride, fairly low sulfate, is roughly 350 degrees C, and it's between 3 and 5 kilometers beneath the surface. So now, as thermal fluids ascend from depth, several factors and processes control the arsenic concentrations, including location relative to the caldera and rhyolite flows, water rock interactions, temperature, residence time, depth of boiling, mixing with shallow groundwater, phase separation, and precipitation of secondary arsenic minerals. So the thermal waters that emerge from depth and equilibrate with the rhyolites are termed alkaline chloride waters or neutral chloride waters. When they emerge from depth but equilibrate with the sedimentary materials like up in Mammoth and the Snake, those are termed carbonate forming thermal waters. And we'll talk a little bit about these water types here in a second to put them in perspective. And then another type that's really important is these acid sulfate waters, which are formed as a result of phase separation here from the deep thermal waters, where carbon dioxide and H2S is separated from the main water, and as the H2S oxidizes and mixes with the shallow groundwaters, form these acid sulfate waters. So the photo on the left shows the 3 main types of waters. We have, this is a photo of Old Faithful, which is the alkaline chloride. Here's a photo of Sulfur Cauldron, which is an acid sulfate. And then here's a photo taken at Mammoth Hot Springs, which is the carbonate forming, and this is a travertine terrace. And then the other type of water, which is much less common in Yellowstone, but we do have several analyses of it, are these dilute meteoric waters that are primarily just heated by the warm rocks. So arsenic in Yellowstone surface water is primarily derived from deep thermal fluids, and the enrichment of arsenic in these waters has been attributed to high temperature leaching of reservoir rocks, primarily the rhyolitic and tuffs. In this photo here on the left is a photo of altered rhyolite lava flows at the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone. And I think this is a really great shot because I can just imagine the hot springs emerging through these rocks and how those interact with it. Arsenic may also originate from magmatic fluids, and there's a lot less evidence of this, but it can't really be ruled out. And finally, there's near surface arsenic sulfides, primarily orphanate and realgar, which are really common in parts of Nora's geyser basin, which I'll show you here in a minute, just where it's at, but it can act as both a sink and a source. It's really a sink during drier periods and potential source during wetter periods and during the formation of new features. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the types of waters, just to understand the arsenic distribution in Yellowstone. And I think it really helps and puts it in perspective. And as I talked about, there's 3 to 4 types. The first type is this alkaline chloride thermal water, and it merges through volcanic rocks, primarily rhyolites, and equilibrates between 170 and 220 degrees. These tend to boil near the surface, and they form center cones around the orifice, and these are primarily located on the western side of the caldera in upper Midway, lower Shoshone, and West Thumb Geyser Basin. And these contribute the most arsenic to the rivers and the flux from Yellowstone because they tend to have really quite high discharges. Chemically, the pH is alkaline, typically 7 to 10, have pretty high chloride concentrations, ranging from 230 to 500 milligrams per liter, relatively low sulfate concentrations. But the arsenic concentrations in these are actually quite elevated and range from about 0.5 milligrams up to 3 milligrams per liter. Again, this is a photo of Old Faithful. So the second important type is this acid sulfate thermal waters. And these are, again, meteoric waters that have been infused with high temperature geothermal gases, primarily CO2 and H2S, which have exhaled from the boiling of alkaline chloride waters at depth. And then as the hydrogen sulfide is oxidized, tends to form these acidic conditions. And these tend to have very low discharge, and the landscape surrounding these are frequently barren and composed primarily of clays and resilient quartz minerals. These types of features are widespread in vapor-dominated thermal areas in the northeastern side of the caldera, including Mud Volcano, Crater Hills, and Washburn Hot Springs. And these are kind of dominated by fumaroles, mud pots, and boiling pools with little to no discharge. So they don't really impact too much the flux of arsenic from the park. Again, these have low pH, actually quite low chloride compared to the alkaline chloride waters. Very high sulfate, 200 to a couple thousand milligrams per liter. And these actually have very, very low arsenic concentrations, usually less than 50 micrograms per liter. So the third type are these carbonate depositing thermal waters. And these types are again found at the far north end and the south end of the park. In the north, there's Mammoth Hot Springs, and to the south is the Snake River Hot Springs, and both of which flow to the surface through sedimentary rocks, primarily limestone and gypsum-bearing shells. And these form travertine terraces. The reservoir temperature where they equilibrate is lower, typically in that 170 degree range. These actually have fairly high discharges. The chloride is actually fairly consistent in both of these thermal areas, about 170 milligrams per liter. And because these come from these sedimentary materials, sulfate, chloride, and magnesium tend to be much higher than they are in the alkaline chloride waters. And because of the lower temperatures, they often have quite a bit lower silica compared to those type of waters. And the arsenic concentrations in these tend to be more kind of in the middle, in the range of 50 ppb up to about 0.5 milligram per liter. So kind of in between the acid sulfate and the alkaline chloride waters. And the last type, there's relatively few of these in Yellowstone that I'm aware of at least, but these are kind of the dilute meteoric water that are just geothermally heated. And these tend to have very low concentrations of most solutes, including arsenic. And I had a hard time finding a photo, but this is one from Mammoth Hot Springs. So here's a map that contains about 300 sites, sample sites. It's kind of hard to see because of overlapping points, but here's the caldera boundary. The red areas here are the thermal areas, and then the color of the dots, points, represent the concentration in the thermal springs that we've measured, with the green being the lowest, and those are the acid sulfate pools, which are predominantly in the vapor dominated area to the northeast of the caldera, north of Yellowstone Lake. The yellow are the kind of the moderate concentrations, which are often found to the north at Mammoth, and then to the south at Snake River. And then in the western part of the caldera are the alkaline chloride waters, which tend to have fairly high arsenic concentrations, and those are represented by this orange color. And then the highest concentrations are these purple colors, and they're trickled throughout the park, but there's some interesting ones that are just north of the park here in this area, where the largest geyser basin is in that type of waters, which is Norris, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then, interestingly enough, Crater Hills as well, and I'll talk about that area here in just a second. So most thermal areas contain a preponderance of one water type. However, Norris geyser basin displays a wide variety of chemical types of waters, including alkaline chloride, acid sulfate, these warm dilute meteoric waters, and mixtures of all of these. And consequently, the distribution of chloride and arsenic in Norris thermal waters also varies greatly. In the next slide, I'll show a great example of mixing effects on arsenic. So in addition, there are a lot of arsenic-rich soils in Norris Geyser Basin, especially in the Ragged Hills area, which is right in here. And at times, I'm convinced we see arsenic spikes in pools because of these superficial secondary minerals. And as far as I know, the highest arsenic concentration measured in Yellowstone was 17 milligrams per liter in an unnamed feature in the Ragged Hills area. And this pool, we measured 17 milligrams per liter, and it typically is about 3 milligrams per liter. And at the time when we measured 17 milligrams per liter, the pool is expanding and the edges were collapsing in. And I think that's maybe what it was attributed to. And so while I'm on this slide, I also wanted to show the effects of elevation on water chemistry. In thermal areas containing mixed water types, often acid sulfate waters containing lower arsenic concentrations are found at higher elevations. So in the West Mint Creek thermal area, which is up here to the northwest of Norris Geyser Basin, many features found on the north end of the basin, so up here, tend to have the lower arsenic concentrations and are classified as acid sulfate waters. And that's compared to the features lower in the drainage, which tend to be more alkaline chloride and have higher arsenic concentrations. So now I'm going to talk about a hot springs pair in Norris Geyser Basin, and this is an area close to that Ragged Hills area. And this particular set of pools is separated by about 1 meter. And Kirk and I and the people we worked with for many years, we monitored it for about 11 years. And the arsenic chloride concentrations show a really great mixing trend, which you can see here on the plot on the right. So in the west pool, which is the one shown on the right, has fluctuating pH in chloride and arsenic concentrations. So the red points here. This pool is often has low pH in the range of about pH of 2, and it's really considered an acid sulfate pool. However, on the eastern pool, or the left one, tends to be a little more, much higher pH, often in the range of 6, and it tends to have much lower sulfate and higher chloride and arsenic concentrations, so the black points there. So in addition to mixing, it's just when these plots show really well, thermal waters in Nora especially have similar arsenic to chloride ratios, and the arsenic and chloride concentrations are either decreased by dilution or increased by boiling. So another area with disparate water types is crater hills. And this is in the kind of in that northeastern quadrant of the caldera. And so as mentioned, most of the features, oops, let me skip that. Sulfur cauldron and nearby features in this crater hill area are flowing and have the highest chloride and geothermometer temperatures anywhere in the park, close to 300 degrees C. And this water appears to represent the most direct upward leakage of fluids in the system. And so apart from that, one sample that we collected in the Ragged Hills area of Nora, where we measured 17 milligrams per liter, the arsenic concentration in Sulphur Spring, which typically ranges from about 4.5 to 6.5 milligrams per liter, is the regularly the highest concentration in Yellowstone. It's a pretty amazing site. So here I'm going to talk about the little box plot here in the middle. And here is just from individual thermal waters in Yellowstone. And most arsenic concentrations in these thermal features range from about 5 ppb up to 4.5 milligrams per liter. It's the vast majority of them, with a few outliers being from the Sulphur Spring area that I just talked about. So for thermal waters, solute concentrations and behavior relative to chloride are often utilized because the majority of chloride in Yellowstone is derived from high temperature water rock interactions, and it behaves conservatively throughout the system. And since arsenic in these thermal waters is positively correlated with chloride, you can see here, it is concluded that arsenic in hot springs is mostly derived from high temperature water rock leaching of these rhyolites and tuff. And variations in arsenic chloride ratios are the result of, at least in part, between the differences in the rhyolite composition, the reservoir temperature, phase separation, boiling, mixing with shallow groundwaters, and secondary mineral formation. So finally, I want to just talk about these lines, and these really represent the arsenic and chloride ranges in the various basins. First, I was going to talk about the black line, which is the best fit through the samples from Mud Volcano and Washburn Hot Springs. And these are the acid sulfate waters. And with the exception of a couple of the springs there, most of them are even lower than this line shows. The typical arsenic or chloride concentrations are less than 100 milligrams per liter there. Next, I talk about the alkaline chloride waters, which there's many of them in the lower, midway, and upper geyser basins. So in this area, and these have kind of a range of chloride, approximately 350 milligrams per liter. And then the green is these well-mixed areas, or highly mixed areas, I should say, near Nora's geyser basin. And I'm going to discuss why some of the arsenic concentrations are exceptionally high here in the next few slides. So Kirk kind of, or definitely coined this slide where he plots the sulfate versus chloride concentrations, which is really useful to describe the process affecting the water composition in Yellowstone. In this figure, it's just modified to a bubble plot with the size of the bubble relative to the arsenic concentration. And I also separated these by color based on pH. So the red being the lower pHs, less than 4, the orange being pHs 4 to 6, And then the higher pHs greater than 6 shown in yellow. And then I also separated out the carbonate forming ones from Mammoth and Snake Hot Springs in black. And so this is really good at showing the contrast in water quality and the effects of phase separation, mixing, boiling, and gas infusion. So first I was going to talk about the meteoric type waters, which we call meteoric with gas infusion, and then the meteoric only waters. So the meteoric only waters are those with those warm dilute meteoric waters that are just convectively heated by rocks. And these have low sulfate, chloride, and arsenic concentrations. Whereas the meteoric with gas waters are equivalent to the acid sulfate waters, and these have really high sulfate, low pH, and then low concentrations of arsenic and chloride concentrations. And these again are formed by rising steam enriched in carbon dioxide and H2S, and those mix with those shallow groundwaters. And since both of these, since arsenic and chloride are low in these types of water, arsenic is predominantly remains in the fluid phase during subsurface boiling and phase separation. So, and then I want to talk about the hydrothermal waters or the alkaline chloride waters, and talk about first the HO, which are what we call hydrothermal only, and then the HB, which is hydrothermal with boiling. And the primarily difference between these two is the depth of boiling. So these are the HOs are the, on the way to the surface, these deep alkaline chloride waters can undergo boiling and degassing. So when it occurs right near the surface, very little phase separation occurs. And these waters are characterized by chloride concentrations roughly 350 milligrams per liter, and arsenic concentrations roughly 100 milligrams per liter. And arsenic concentrations in these are about 1 to 2, maybe 3 milligrams per liter. A hydrothermal with boiling, these guys occur when the boiling happens at depth and phase separation occurs, which H2S is exhaled from the solution. So you get an increase in chloride without the increase in sulfate concentrations. And the sulfate or the arsenic concentrations in these waters tend to be higher. And so a lot of these type of waters are kind of the end rivers that you see in Nora Geyser Basin, because phase separation has occurred and the remaining fluid is elevated in arsenic and chloride, but not sulfate. And finally, these hydrothermal with boiling and gas are up here. And these are the waters from the Sulphur Springs area in Crater Hills, which have the highest arsenic concentrations. And these have undergone extensive boiling at depth and are rich in H2S that is oxidized to sulfate. And as a result of the extensive boiling, the arsenic concentrations have been increased as well. So stable water isotopes can provide additional insight into the chemical processes affecting arsenic concentrations. And here I have a plot of delta D plotted against delta O18 for the thermal waters in Yellowstone. And first, the water isotopes for the meteoric waters, shown here in blue, generally plot closest to the global meteoric line here and are reflected of warm water, dilute meteoric waters just free of arsenic that are conductively heated by rocks. So now, while the arsenic and major ion chemistry are similar for the samples from Mammoth and Snake River, which are shown here, the Snake Rivers are higher and the Mammoth down here are quite similar, but there is a difference in their water isotopes, which indicates a different water source. And in addition, there's a delta O18 shift for the waters from Mammoth, which is caused by isotopic exchange with the rocks, primarily the silicates and carbonates. And similarly, here, there's a shift for the hydrothermal waters that have undergone extensive boiling at depth, and there's a shift to the right there, which is indicative of additional boiling and exchange with rocks. And then finally, for water isotopes from the Crater Hills area, the HBG, these are consistent with extensive boiling at depth. And then finally, I want to talk about the acid sulfate waters, the MG type waters, where they have very little discharge and high evaporation. And these are shifted way to the right over here. And the arsenic tends to remain quite low in these because the steam that heats them is lacking arsenic. So now I'm going to move on a little bit and talk about the arsenic redox distribution in geothermal sources, which is shown in the plot here, where we have arsenic-3 plotted against arsenic total concentrations, or the ratio of arsenic-3 to arsenic total ratios plotted against H2S concentrations. It's a little hard to see because the points are plotted on top of each other here. But for the majority of the pools, arsenic-3 is dominant, especially for higher H2S concentrations. And this is because deep thermal water primarily contains arsenic in its reduced oxidation state. And the presence of reduced sulfur species inhibits the oxidation of arsenic-3 to arsenic-5. And these abiotic reactions are very slow in air. So consequently, when H2S is present, arsenic is the dominant form. And however, mixing with shallow oxygenated groundwaters and stagnant pools or low flowing springs may create conditions favorable for arsenic-5. In some pools where the arsenic-3-5 ratio can vary depending on proximity to the main orifice and collection depth. So I do want to point out that all of these arsenic-3 determinations that at least I performed on our project were done by hydride generation. And the arsenic-3 is operationally defined and includes the reduced arsenic species that readily form arsine. And these include arsenite and likely methyl and thioarsenic species as well. And I'll show this in the next couple of slides. So while arsenic-3 is typically the dominant arsenic redox species, arsenic-3 rapidly oxidizes in discharge channels and overflows. So here we have two plots of arsenic and sulfide concentrations with downstream distance. So here the black line are arsenic total concentrations, the red is arsenic-3, and then the blue is the H2S concentrations. And this is for an alkaline chloride pool, Ojo Caliente and Lower Geyser Basin, and then Nymphy Creek, just north of Norris Geyser Basin. And in both cases, as soon as the sulfide decreases, arsenic-3 rapidly oxidizes. And so I'm not a microbiologist, but it is well known that these redox changes are primarily catalyzed by microbes, archaea, and eukaryotes. And arsenic-3 oxidation can rapidly occur at the spring surface and along drainage channels once the reduced sulfur species are depleted by either degassing or oxidation. And thermophiles associated with the colorful microbial maps, these are a lot of what Yellowstone is known for, and the biofilms are known to rapidly oxidize arsenic-3 to 5, either for energy or to lessen its toxicity. And this is really important because the fate of arsenic in rivers is controlled by arsenic-5 geochemistry, which we'll discuss more. And also because arsenic-5 tends to be less toxic than arsenic-3. So when the chemical speciation, not just the redox state of arsenic is considered, but also the arsenic sulfide complexes, the picture is much more complex. So while arsenate and arsenite are likely very important redox or arsenic species in all of these features and drainages, thioarsenic species have been identified and are also important in many features in Yellowstone. So similar to what I just showed, arsenic and total and sulfide concentrations are shown here on the right. So here's the arsenic total concentration in this one, and then this decreasing sulfide concentrations. And this scale is actually a little bit higher. So the arsenic total concentrations would be near the top of the screen, and the mass balance does work out. But in this slide, they also show, or Brita actually showed, the amount of tri, di, and monothioarsenates were quantified. And those are shown here with the open circles. And what they tend to show is that there's a significant amount of these arsenic species, especially when arsenic or sulfide concentrations are higher. So as the sulfide decreases, you get a decrease in these species and an increase in arsenite here. And then eventually the sulfide concentrations get low enough where you then get an oxidation and an increase in arsenate or arsenic 5, which is here. So it's consistent with what we have, but it's much more detailed in that it includes the arsenic sulfide or thiol complexes. And this tends to be most important in features with high pH. And so, so regardless of the thermal type, arsenic complex, and microbial archaean or eukaryotic catalyzed oxidative processes occurring along all these channels, arsenate is the primary end product, and the fluvial transport of arsenic is controlled by arsenic geochemistry. And this is really important for the rest of my presentation here. So most thermal waters discharged from Yellowstone, these hot springs, that ultimately ends up in a river in Yellowstone. And so downstream of the thermal inputs in Yellowstones are simply just a mixture of the dilute stream waters, primarily from dilute snowmelt or dilute groundwaters. And these tend to mix with the geothermal waters as they discharge and drain into the river. And so the fate of arsenic is just controlled by arsenic 5 geochemistry. And so as part of the riverine chloride flux monitoring program in Yellowstone, the USGS and the National Park Service have been determining the chloride concentration and fluxes at several monitoring sites throughout Yellowstone for almost 40 years, with the idea being that during volcanic unrest, changes in the hydrothermal system and discharge will be detected in the chloride flux. And the chloride flux is a really useful proxy for the heat flux. And it turns out that this chloride flux monitoring program has been really useful for monitoring the arsenic flux as well. So the chloride flux program currently includes 10 monitoring sites, and all of these sites receive thermal input. So to the north, the difference between these colors, so the green and purple are the monitoring sites, and the difference between the green and the purple is the green sites have telemetry data where we can capture it, at least internally, continually. But we monitor the Yellowstone River, the Gardner River, Tantalus Creek, the Madison, Firehole Gibbon, the Firehole River near Old Faithful, the Snake River, the Fall River, and then the discharge from Yellowstone Lake we capture at Fishing Bridge. And so beginning in 2010, specific conductance was used as a surrogate for chloride, and which works really well, but it also turns out to work really well for several other geothermal solutes as well, including arsenic. And because specific conductance is used, it's easy to co-locate these probes near USGS stream gauges and collect 15-minute data. And so here's just an example of using specific conductance as a proxy for arsenic in these Yellowstone rivers. So here we have a plot of arsenic concentrations against specific conductance for 6 of the monitoring sites. And these data are just from discrete samples collected over a wide range of hydrologic conditions. And these have really good correlations. Most range from about 0.95 to 0.98. And this is really pretty amazing because I feel, and because of this, specific conductance is really a pretty great surrogate for arsenic. And it's also a bit surprising because the arsenic transference number, which is the fraction of the specific conductance due to arsenic, is really quite small, less than 0.1%. But the specific conductance proxy models work really well for arsenic for a couple of reasons. So first, looking at the plot on the left here, which is arsenic chloride ratio plotted against chloride, the arsenic chloride ratio is fairly constant between areas and water types, especially for the majority of the alkaline chloride, the HO the HB type waters, as well as the waters from Sulphur Spring. And these are the ones that have the higher discharges and the higher arsenic chloride ratios. So in addition to that, for any one pool, the arsenic chloride ratio is fairly constant with time. And so here are some arsenic chloride ratios plotted against chloride for pools from Nora Geyser Basin. And if you look at, say, this pink one, which is perpetual spouter, on the far right here, you can see there's, the arsenic chloride ratio is really steady. Even the chloride may vary a bit over time. And then second, there's very little arsenic attenuation in the rivers of Yellowstone. And arsenic absorption to many of the surfaces is less prominent at higher pH. The available absorption sites are likely saturated with arsenic or perhaps coated with silica. All these thermal waters are rich in silica. And Kirk talked about this a little bit in his presentation. And finally, and I feel probably most importantly, most of these rivers are very low iron, which are known to be source of arsenic concentration or source of arsenic. Sorry, I got a phone call. And the plot on the right shows the behavior of arsenic in the Firehole River. The upper figure shows that the total recoverable arsenic concentrations, which are shown here in black, are quite similar to the dissolved concentrations. The red points are inflows. And because those are nearly equal, suggests that that arsenic is conservative. And further evidence of this is shown in the bottom plot, where we have that arsenic flux or load. And again, we have the two things. One is the dissolved load is very similar to the total load, suggesting little arsenic is attenuated, and there are no decreases in loads with distance. And so between both of those, there's good evidence that arsenic is not attenuated in the rivers. So at each monitoring site that is associated with the US stream gauge, specific conductance and discharge are collected every 15 minutes, which allow for high resolution concentration and flux measurements. And this is just a couple examples from the Firehole River and the Yellowstone River of the type of data that's collected. And so that any one time, a simple specific conductance measurements allows us to estimate arsenic concentrations and fluxes. So I think it's a pretty amazing tool. So in addition to the gauges, we have performed many synoptic studies for nearly every river reach in Yellowstone that receives thermal inflows. And so all these ones that are highlighted in the darker blue are river reaches that we have performed synoptic sampling in. And this has allowed us to quantify the thermal solute sources and their fate downstream. For nearly every river reach in Yellowstone, the fluvial transport of arsenic behaves conservatively. And that is that it flows, arsenic reaches these rivers and it flows right out of the park. And again, primarily because this is a very low iron system, and the high silica coatings of many of these surfaces don't tend to absorb arsenic, and along with the higher pH of the river waters creates these unfavorable conditions for arsenic 5 retention. The one exception that we have found is Obsidian Creek, just in and around Roaring Mountain, where we have the arsenic or the iron concentrations shown here in red is actively oxidizing and precipitating, and arsenic appears to be co-precipitating and is attenuated. So, by about 4 kilometers downstream of this input, arsenic is completely attenuated to the stream bed. So here's just a map showing typical arsenic concentrations in late summer. So what we have here are the colors indicating the arsenic concentrations in these rivers, and kind of under base flow when it has the most people there. And so the green are the lowest, which are less than 10 micrograms per liter, or which is the drinking water standard. Yellow river reaches are 1 to 5 times the drinking water standard, so 10 to 50 micrograms per liter. The orange colors are 5 to 15 times the drinking water standard. And then the blue stretches are really high, greater than 150 micrograms per liter. The highest river reach is down here just beneath the upper Midway and lower geyser basins, which typically it's pushing 400 micrograms per liter at that site. And as arsenic is transported through and downstream of Yellowstone, it really impacts the drinking water sources. And then within Yellowstone, especially at Old Faithful, they've had some issues with their drinking water there. And it also affects aquatic and riparian habitats, recreational water, and poses threats to aquatic wildlife and human health. And the more backcountry trips I've taken, where I actually drink these surface waters, it's comforting knowing where the arsenic concentrations are high in these various rivers. So at least I think it's quite useful. So here is a map actually showing the flux of arsenic in each river. And since 2010, when we began using the specific conductance, we've determined that 183 metric tons or 183 kilograms of arsenic is leaving Yellowstone on an annual basis. And this plot, or the figures on the left, shows the actual fluxes at each of the sites within each river basin as well. And so looking at the two figures on the right, the majority of the arsenic leaves via the Madison River, so 60%, or about 110,000 kilograms per year leaves through the Madison River. And the Madison River forms where the Firehole and Gibbon River come together here. And so the Firehole River makes up the vast majority of the arsenic flux in the Madison River, approximately 85,000 kilograms per year. Similarly, the Yellowstone River to the north transports almost 50,000 kilograms of arsenic per year, and it has major inflows from the Gardner River here, as well as from Yellowstone Lake. And then the Snake River and the Falls River to the south also contribute a fair bit of arsenic. And then we've also able to calculate individual point sources or fluxes. So the Boiling River to the north here is the largest point source of arsenic, and it contributes over 9,000 kilograms per year, which is larger than the arsenic flux from either Lassen or Long Valley by itself. Panelist Creek, which is approximately 7,000 kilograms per year. And then even to the south, there's a large thermal drainage that feeds into the Snake River, which is roughly 3,000 kilograms per year, arsenic flowing from it. So move on. And so this is my last slide, and I've taken this from the Montana Department of Environmental Quality, and just shows the approximate downstream distance from Yellowstone where arsenic concentrations are still greater than 10 micrograms per liter, which is the human health standard for surface waters. And so for the Madison River, which flows out here on the western part, it flows almost 700 kilometers downstream after it even forms into the Missouri River before the arsenic concentrations reach or fall below 10 micrograms per liter. And then similarly for the Yellowstone River here, it flows nearly 350 kilometers before its concentrations decrease below 10 micrograms per liter. And these rivers, flow through and are, good sized towns. There's lots of agricultural use of these waters, and it feeds the groundwater system along the way. So it has a big impact downstream from Yellowstone. And with that, I'm happy to try to answer any questions, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Blaine. It's amazing the amount of data that you have from Yellowstone.
It really is a lot of data, and of course, most of that all started with Kirk. So
And a lot of questions that you have answered too. So it's amazing. A great presentation. Just to let you know, we have 17 participants
Wow.
in you on Zoom, and on the YouTube channel we have 13.
Oh, wow.
And we already have some questions for you, and we want to let the participants that they can ask questions on YouTube and we can read the questions. And in Zoom, you can either write or you can ask yourself and interact. So the first question here in Zoom is from Mauricio Ormachea from Bolivia. He is asking, how is hot water sampling done? Do you use special tools? And what about field parameters? For example, how do you measure alkalinity? Samples should be analyzed in hot water or wait until they are cold. Same for the electrical conductivity, pH, dissolved oxygen, and how the temperature affect field parameters results in the laboratory.
Oh, this is actually a really important question, and it's been really something that I think's been really well thought out on our project over the many years. So I think I'll start with the field parameters. We use a flow-through cell to equilibrate or to calibrate the pH at the temperature or as close to the temperature of the pool as possible. So we measure and calibrate the pH on site just prior to measure, and then we check the standards to ensure that the temperature compensation of those buffers is in range of where they should be. So those are really important to do on-site calibration. Specific conductance is actually quite interesting because, especially for the acid sulfate pools, the typical conductivity temperature compensation that is applicable to most waters is not for acid waters, and that's because the transport properties of the hydrogen ion is much different than the other ones. And so we have a paper out that discusses how to properly correct low pH waters, and it's more important for these thermal waters. So the temperature compensation is something that's very important for the specific conductance. As far as collecting water samples, we filter and process right on site. Many parameters we measure on site, including like H2S we measure on site, or preserve and measure as quickly as possible with an ion selective electrode. We have done many on-site colorimetric measurements as well of H2S. What am I missing, Kirk? The alkalinity we typically collect and measure fairly quickly, but not on site, usually within a week or two. And that's primarily the pH is affected, but the alkalinity is not, because many of these waters are, did I say that wrong? The alkalinity is not effective, even though the pH may increase in some of these waters that are rich in CO2. I'm sure I'm forgetting something that Kirk could add. Oh, we can't hear you, Kirk, or I can't.
You can't hear me now?
No, I can hear you now, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, the alkalinity is kind of an interesting story, but I don't want to make this long, but the first time that I went to Yellowstone sampling was in 1974 as a graduate student. And we weren't sure how to handle alkalinity at that time. And the general thinking was you should do alkalinity in the field as soon as possible. So we had a chemist with us who had the job of doing the alkalinities. And he was really upset because he would add some acid to the sample and the pH would increase. He'd add some more acid and the pH would increase more. And that's because as he added acid, it would degas CO2, and that would cause the pH to go up. And so you never got to where you wanted to be within a reasonable time frame. And then we read some papers later by the New Zealand geothermal chemists who said that they've tested this and they've found that, in fact, if you let the sample degas and cool down and then titrate it the normal way, you will get the same alkalinity value, because alkalinity, as Blaine said, is conservative, and you can look that up in Stuhm and Morgan or someplace else. So the only thing that can change alkalinity is if calcite is precipitating, or the odd case, which we have had happen, but it doesn't affect our results, where if you have a sample long enough, algae grows in it, and then the alkalinity does change as well. But those are the only two exceptions, and those don't happen, or they happen to such a insignificant extent that it's within the error of the measurement. There are lots of other aspects that we can't go into right now, but trying to measure for things like thioarsenates and other things take special procedures and special preservatives. And when Blaine, maybe you can remind me how many sample bottles that we use for all these different kinds of parameters, but I think it's up to 8 or 9.
I think the last one of the last strips we took, we had 12 different splits, because like something like silica, we dilute on site because it's usually, super saturated, and the thiosulfate species, the ammonia species, and the list just goes on, and we end up with quite a few sample splits. So, and then we were collecting for mercury and different species like that as well.
I should mention one other thing before I forget it. Just in the last decade, we've been really interested in getting better samples at different depths. There's not too many hot springs where you can go very deep, but there's a few that you can get down a bit, and then there's a drill hole that we can sample that's quite deep. And that we discovered requires a special kind of a pump called a bladder pump. So you want to be able to push the water from depth rather than pulling it through what we used to use, a pump at the surface. And we got much better results for trace elements when we started using a bladder pump as opposed to the peristaltic pump that sucks the water up.
Especially for things like that degas easily.
Yeah.
I have a comment from Maria de Rosario Melo Costa, and she's saying that fortunately she participated in some field work 15 years ago in Yellowstone, in this amazing place with these amazing colleagues, Kirk and Blaine. Hello, Maria.
Maria, nice to see you there. Yes, they're very fun trips.
There is a question on YouTube. Agostina Chiodi from Argentina. She's working on geothermal waters in the Puna and the Andes. And she's asking that in one slide, you show 2 pools with different chemicals compositions, one next to the other. That is Norris, right?
Yes.
And what is the explanation for this geochemical difference if these pools are so close? Structural control?
Do you want to take this, Kirk? You probably have the better explanation, but I feel like he would answer it better than I would. But yeah, please.
Yeah, well, this is a very, very interesting place. It's, I think, the only place that we found quite like that, where there's just several centimeters of center barrier between 2 pools that have different chemistries. And so when we discovered this, we started sampling them separately for a long time, as Blaine mentioned, and discovered that they reflected a really nice 2 end member mixing line. In addition to which, again, we don't have time for the story, but I've looked at the water isotopes and tried to model the water isotopes as well, and discovered that you can explain the whole change in chemistry by 2 processes. One is mixing, as I mentioned. The other one is evaporation at the surface. And this is something that we're working on right now, is using this as a model to help explain the wide variety of chemistry of other hot springs in the area. Well, this is 100 Springs Plain and Nora Geyser Basin generally. But it was really quite an exciting find when we started plotting up our data on that, and very unusual. Now, I should mention one other thing, that there are a few other springs where you see a pool that's the neutral chloride type that Blaine mentioned, and a few meters away, you'll see an acid sulfate pool. And there's several of these that are that close together, which suggests this phase separation that Blaine talked about, where you have the H2S coming out in the volatile gaseous phase, creating the sulfuric acid for the one pool, and then the other, and that has low chloride, and the other pool has the has been degassed and has the high chloride in it. So you see a number of those things, but not quite like these two side-by-side pools that we call crystal sisters.
Yeah, that's a pretty amazing sight.
Yeah.
To think that they're not just merged into one.
When we first found it, we thought it was one because the water level was high and it was murky and it covered both pools. And we thought it was just one pool. And then it was actually Brita Planer-Friedrich who said, hey, we came back and we found that there's two pools here. Why don't you sample both of them? And so then we did.
Well, and it's got to be, I'm thinking, separated kind of by a silica center separation. That's pretty resilient.
Yeah. It's pretty amazing to see that thin wall separate those two. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So I have a question myself. You show the arsenic chlorine radius that explain very well the variation of arsenic and how arsenic is coming from the sources to the rivers. And I want to ask if we can, here in the Puna, in the Altiplano and Puna, we have in the lakes or the saline, in the center of the basins, or sometimes some aquifers, we also have high arsenic and chlorine concentrations. And if we can also use this ratio in our places, or is only for geothermal waters?
You know, I think are you talking about using specific conductance as a proxy?
Also, yeah.
Yeah, I think that it would be something that you would have to test out to make sure that it works there. I think these are pretty highly site specific, and it works really well for Yellowstone, as I mentioned, because arsenic is pretty conservative there, and then it's discharged at these fairly constant ratios. So, but in other systems, I'm not sure that it would work as well. I think Yellowstone is exceptionally unique in that it does work. What do you think, Kirk?
Well, one of the reasons why it works well at Yellowstone is because high chloride concentrations are associated with the deep thermal water. Okay, and if you go to a basin like Los Pozuelos, you don't have that. Chloride is still conservative, but there's not that much around, as I recall, and so that's not going to work. But there may be some other conservative element that does work. So you just have to, as Blaine said, test it and see what works for that environment.
Mm-hmm.
There have been other mining sites that I'm aware of where specific conductance, it's Stibnite Kirk mine, where antimony and arsenic have been able, or specific conductance has been able to be used as a proxy there. So, and that's of course a low chloride system.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's a sulfate in that system, right, Blaine?
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So, I don't know if somebody else from the participants have some questions.
I'm sorry you missed, Marta, but you can see it on YouTube.
Yeah, Marta Liter.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I will, and I will be for the next season at time. I'm sorry.
That's happened to me a couple of times for this series.
Thanks, Marta. I have a question from Maria do Rosario Melo. In pH below 3, arsenic is below 0.5. Why so low arsenic?
That's a good question. It's primarily because those thermal waters are generated by phase separation from the deeper water. So the arsenic is staying in the alkaline chloride waters, and the heat and gases are being dissolved from those. And then when those mix with the surface waters, they're arsenic free. And so you generate these acidic pools from the oxidation of the sulfide, which is from depth, but there's no arsenic associated with those type of waters.
Hopefully you understand that, but at depth there's boiling. So gas separates from the fluid phase. So certain volatile components go into the gas and the rest of it stays in the fluid. Arsenic is one that tends to stay mostly in the fluid phase. And so it's high in the neutral chloride waters, and it's not going to be in the acid sulfate waters.
I have from YouTube, Carlos Monjo from Argentina. He's saying, very nice presentation. Blaine, thanks you very much. Nice to see Kirk and Jessica online. My regards from Mendoza. Agostina Chiodi, thanks very much for the presentation. And I have another here in Zoom, Mohammad Asai Alam. Thanks, Blaine, for the nice and informative talk. Thanks, Kirk, for valuable inputs. I need to leave for another meeting. Take care and stay safe. So I have another question. Yes, about the amazing effect of silica precipitation in the rivers, and that keeps arsenic 5 in solution, and it's also the effect of the pH. It's a combination of both.
So it's actually pretty amazing because all these thermal waters are rich in silica and they're warm, and when they hit the cooler river waters, they form almost like a concrete barrier. You can't even drive a rebar into the riverbeds, at least throughout the park that I've seen in most of these rivers. And they coat all the surfaces, and I think it's and then these waters tend to be, the river waters tend to be at least pH 8. And so I think between all of that, arsenic is just not attenuated in most river reaches. Do you have anything else, Kirk? That's a pretty big process there, and unique in these thermal areas.
Yeah, no, you've stated it very well, Blaine. And when we were realizing the effect of the high pH and the high silica concentrations, I began to realize how that this should have some implications for other thermal areas, like in Chile and New Zealand and Japan and so forth, where you should see the same effect in places. And I think that should be looked at more closely.
Okay. I have Carla Barbosa Troncoso. Thank you for the presentation. I'm a master's student interested on geochemistry of geothermal waters, and I have learned a lot from this. So
good.
Great, Carla. Very good.
Yeah.
Elena Ceballos from Argentina. Thank you for the presentation. And cheers from the Chaco Pampean Plain in Argentina. Okay, so if you have more questions, it's time to ask because we're very close to the end.
I might just make a comment going back to the first question by Maurizio, which is that if you're sampling thermal waters, it's twice as difficult as a normal water. Waters can be any kind of groundwater can be difficult, but you have to study the literature, see what other people have done, how have they sampled things, and how have they handled different constituents and preserved them and so forth, and see what kind of problems they ran into. That's a really key thing, because if you don't collect a sample right to begin with, then the data may not be any good and you've just wasted your time and money. So start with the pioneers who've gone before you and see how they've handled it, and then see how you can get good equipment and analyses to do the same thing.
Yep. It's been a continual learning process for us.
Okay. Well, so I want to thank you very much, Blaine. Your talk was amazing. All the pictures, all the data.
That's great thing about Yellowstone. A lot of good pictures.
Yeah. So, well, so we invite everyone to our next talk on 14th of June, it's going to be by Bernard Dahl. He will talk about the arsenic concentrations in tailings impoundment, so, and all the remediation solutions. So also it's going to be very interesting. And well, thank you very much.
Yep, thank you for having me. Good to see everybody.
Thank you.
Hi, Maria.